Hello, good evening to you and welcome to News at 10, live here on TV3 from our news up here at Desawe in Kanda and Accra. My name is Alfred Akwasi. All around the world, you can also follow us live on our Facebook pages, TV3 Ghana, also on 3news.com. TV3 is live on DSTV channel 279. Let's settle now for the headlines amid the stories throughout the day. The Inter-Party Coalition for National Sovereignty, a group of opposition parties, has vowed to oppose the Ghana-US military agreement. Despite the president's assurance that the deal does not seek to establish a military base in Ghana, the coalition at a news conference in Accra asked the president to stop being defiant and take the best decision in their view. Expectant mothers in the South District of the Ashanti region dread giving birth at the SDA hospital at Asamang. The health facility is severely challenged. Of much concern to them is a single incubator which is malfunctioning. And government has signed an agreement with China for the construction of the Jamestown Fishing Port Complex in Accra. Under the agreement, China will be providing about $50 million for the implementation of the project, expected to create about 1,000 jobs opportunities for the youth in the area. And on the international front, 7 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces during fresh protests on Gaza's border with Israel. Palestinian Health Ministry officials have said the Israeli military said troops had opened fire when people attempted to breach the fence on the frontier. Well, that's some of the news that made headlines for the day. But remember, there's a lot more news on 3news.com. Let's not settle for the big one tonight. Now, government intends to launch a policy for public servants to be paid strictly according to the number of hours they work. Now, the public sector said that the public service would be automated in order to promote efficiency and productivity. A new strategy was announced days after some drivers of the Metro Mass Transit were suspended after they came to work late. Some staff of the Comptroller and Accountant General's Department were also held up on Thursday for reporting late to work. The new policy, to be launched by President Akufo-Addo next month, would eventually ensure that civil servants are paid per the number of hours they work. The whole system would be automated with time clocking in place. A new public sector reform strategic document has been approved by government. Let's still stay on this particular story. Professor Justice Barley is a co-chair of the technical committee that drew this particular public sector reforms document, which is going to be implemented from next month. Prof, thank you very much for your time this evening on the telephone line. So this is not the first time we're going down this road of instituting some reforms in the public sector. Would you say that the ones that have been implemented previously, which did not achieve the results, we have indeed reviewed and learned why they failed?
Thank you very much for having me, and good evening to your listeners. I think that we have learned lessons. It is important to state, however, that learning lessons itself not enough to sustain any new initiative. It is important that those lessons that are learned or are known or become known are actually actions are actually taken to ensure that we don't repeat the errors or the mistakes that we made. So yes, we have reviewed the initiatives that have been implemented in the past. We have established from those reviews that many of these reform initiatives were supply driven. In other words, somebody sits somewhere and decides that, well, Ghana needs a certain reform initiative, and therefore let's go ahead and propose something. We also found that in line with the first point, there have been a number of these that have been actually isolated and sporadic reform initiatives. In other words, they are not completely linked up to other areas, and therefore, even when successes were chalked, they could not be replicated in the way that ensured that the public sector as a whole got benefits. There were also issues about a national strategy and whether or not the things that we did actually were within a certain framework.
That's right.
And so you know that this is for the first time that we have actually developed a reform strategy, as it were, to try and pull all the disparate reform initiatives together to make sure that at any point you have your eyes on what is going on.
But you know, Prof, now there's a strategy, but previously there was a whole ministry established, the Public Sector Reform Ministry, headed by now flag bearer of the PPP, Dr. Akwasi. I mean, they tried to do something, but in the end, we came back to square one. The lateness is there, the Friday funeral syndrome is there, the lack of productivity is there. I mean, really, will this be sustained with what you've started now? I mean, locking out people who come after 8 a.m. and all. How sustainable is it?
I'm sorry. The committee that has been working on this document has not locked anybody out. So sorry, but I dare to say that if you look at the kind of successes that were chalked when we actually had a public sector reform ministry, you would realize how many of you at the time, actually went to the ministry's area. But I should say that for a very long time, we have not had a certain revitalized ethos for the public sector as we had then, where you entered an office and you saw that the environment was conducive for people to work. And the fact that the area had a certain, I just to say, even the dress code of the public service, it changed along those lines. So if we say that we didn't achieve anything, lateness and stuff continues, that's probably exaggerating the...
No, I agree. I talked about the fact that, not to interrupt you though, with all due respect, but I'm saying that we achieved something. It is the sustainability of the change that was witnessed during that period is where my concern is.
Yes, and that is exactly the problem that we also identified, that over the years what we have not found has been maybe 3 key or 4 key things. One, we haven't done consistent monitoring of the initiatives to ensure uptake so that there can be synergy. In many cases, these reform initiatives were donor funded, and so if they were not quick wins, as it were, to show the donor that we were making progress, the resources for the continuation of the project actually ceased. There were also political party activists and politicians who actually had more interest in their own pet project rather than driving a public sector reform strategy. And while we were unable to show some demonstrable results, then interest gradually waned.
Right.
And that is why in the current dispensation, I think that the office, the Reform Secretariat, headed by a CEO and overseen by the Senior Minister, may be doing something different, because now the zeal is there. We have a coordinated program, that is captured in this strategy document that ensures that all of the various parts, in other words, now we are looking at it within a holistic framework and say that the various parts that we will require to keep our eyes on we actually have our eyes on them, and to make sure we consistently drive the results. Let's be honest. This is Ghana. The public sector is not isolated. The people who work in the public sector are Ghanaians. They are drawn from a Ghanaian environment. And so, in the end, it boils down to you and I, who have our relatives there, to kind of like put pressure on them. Otherwise, a couple of years from now, we may be having this conversation again.
I see. There was a point in a history where the government pretended to be paying, and public sector workers also pretended to be working. But there's something that's been witnessed. The public sector staff, some, if they leave the public sector and get into the private sector, attitudes change. They become more productive, But so it's an attitudinal problem. This strategy that you have put together, does it take into consideration the reformation of the attitudes and not so much about checking those other peripherals that go around just the attitude, but not the root cause of the problem of the private sector, the public sector?
Well, I should say that the current strategy that we developed has 6 pillars. And pillar 2, which talks about capable and disciplined workforce, actually has a number of projects in there that seek to address the issue of attitudes and what have you. So we are not oblivious of the fact that attitudes are important, but you will agree with me that attitudes are things that change over a long period of time. It is not a quick fix thing. And so what our resolve is within this framework is to ensure that there is a consistent effort that is made at not only putting pressure to say civil servants should change and do X, Y, and Z, but also that we create the environment that actually entice people to work well.
Right.
Why would a bank staff leave the office at 5 a.m. and get to office early, and why would a civil servant not do same? We need to also ask those questions. We need to, like you said, the public service must begin to pay well. Why would I resign from a World Bank job, and take up a position in the civil service and then get paid a paltry sum that cannot even feed my family?
Absolutely.
So these are very, very tough questions we need to ask. So whereas we are struggling and urging the servants to work well, it is also important for the government to ensure that whatever it takes to get the servant to work well is put in place.
Prof, maybe 30 seconds. These 6 pillars that this document you've developed is hinged on. Could you just run through them for us, for the sake of
So we have pillar 1 says citizen and private sector focus public sector. Pillar 2 says capable and disciplined workforce. Pillar 3 is strengthened public sector regulatory framework. Pillar 4 is modernize and improve work conditions. Pillar 5 says strengthen local governance structures. And Pillar 6 is digitize public sector services and systems. Now, what we have done is to say that these 6 pillars can be grouped into kind of like 3 key elements. To say that we need to see what the purpose of the public service is.
Right.
We need to focus on the personnel who will deliver the services, and we need to ensure that the processes are streamlined.
Great.
To ensure that the service can be delivered.
Prof, thank you for your time this evening, and I am extremely grateful. Professor Justice Baule is a co-chair of the technical committee that drew up the public sector reform document, which is going to be launched, and eventually the implementation starts next month. So live here on News at 10 on TV3. We'll be back shortly after this quick one. Do stay. So welcome back to News at 10 here on TV3. There has been some mixed reactions among the public to President Akufo-Addo's speech on the Ghana-United States of America Defense Cooperation Agreement. My colleague Kwabena Jemfi has been interacting and engaging public reactions after yesterday's address.
A week after some Ghanaians took to the streets of Accra to protest the defense cooperation agreement between Ghana and USA, the president yesterday gave his response to the whole situation, and the experts have spoken. But back to the streets of Accra, I'm finding out what you also think about the president's response.
It's clear-cut. He has made his point. I am convinced. Let us pursue it to its logical conclusion.
I disagree with it. That's all I can say.
Why do you disagree?
If you look at it, wherever you find the Americans, you always find the Al-Qaeda or ISIS and all the others. Look what happened in Kenya some years ago. At that time, the biggest embassy outside America was in Kenya, and they bombed it. Those Kenyans who get the injury, none of them has been compensated. If they are, maybe chicken change. But the Americans who were injured in it, when they take them to America, then compensation that they gave them was something. But how about the Africans?
Okay. So you are not satisfied with the president's response?
No, I'm not.
According to what the president said, means that there is not going to be any US-based military here. Therefore, I think it shouldn't be any fear, or as the opposition is trying to make us to understand. For me, he's the president, and then he signed the agreement, and he knows what it entails. So I think I side with him on the press release that he gave yesterday.
He has said it all. The other governments you signed, and now Akufo-Addo too is coming to sign, and you don't want to agree with it. No, so we are okay. Whatever he said, perfect. I'm 100% in support of him. Whatever he said.
Kasa wakano ese mehu ya obia wo ma amanfo ese gusu edid na tem se ese wanka say ye na 2020 ese ombetu na free so a lot of things they are saying.
Interesting views there. But early on News 360, I spoke with Professor Bafo Agyemendua on the fallout of the president's address on the Ghana-US military cooperation agreement. After the president's statement or address yesterday, the conversation has not been so much about the substance of what he said. It's been about the form in which it came. I want to find out your thoughts about this. Did this form overshadow the substance so much to take away the focus on some of the things that were in there?
To a large extent, yes, because most of the comments today has been on the theatrical, so to speak, of the event, which is to say the demeanor, his tone, and someone has beautifully analyzed his communication skills of yesterday. Absolutely. So it seems to me that first of all, the central message or the purpose of the message may have been missed, because the idea was to educate the people on this agreement, hopefully to cool down tempers for people to begin to understand perhaps the reality of this agreement. But I think to some extent that was not successful, because the focus has not been on the substance of his presentation, but more on the gestures and other things that he did.
So now let's go into the substance. Did he address your concerns about this agreement prior to yesterday?
Well, my concerns have been stated already publicly. I did put an article in the Graphic of last Thursday and expressed my own concerns about this. But I stated categorically that it is not true that the sovereignty of this country has been sold by this agreement.
Right.
But I made the point that, for sure, some compromises have been made. And that is true in almost all arrangements or agreements between nations, especially between the powerful nations and the smaller nations.
We shouldn't have expected fairness in the sense of the word.
Inherently, yes, because the person who's coming to you is coming with a greater largesse, so to speak. And you are looking for something that you don't have the means to get. Normally, we want equity. Sovereignty gives equity to nations.
Absolutely. I mean,
exactly.
So if the principle of equity is fundamental to diplomatic negotiations or relations, why then you know, relegate it, or why then want to push it in going into an agreement like this with the United States? I mean, despite the fact that they might be the superpowers or the big nations, equity is equity.
Equity is equity, I agree. But if two parties are negotiating and one has power, and power, not just military power, but economic power and greater political influence, and the other one does not have that, certainly it will be difficult to attain equity. And that's where the problem is. And this is true with almost all arrangements between imperial countries, the United States, Russia, China, and the European countries. Whenever they are engaging the smaller countries, this has been part of the problem. So we see we have a responsibility to sharpen our own negotiation skills and also to find a way to mitigate some of the issues that we face, because some of the problems that we face can be met without necessarily resorting to these external powers. Because once you get yourself involved with these external powers, look, if we are going to meet the Chinese today to get either 10 million, 2 million, or 10 billion, as they've been saying, mind you are going to give up something.
True.
In the same way, our previous arrangements with the British, we were shortchanged. So I think the challenge is for us to find ways of improving ourselves, making better use of the facilities that we have in terms of a natural endowment, so we can get out of this dependency syndrome. So I think that in these arrangements, and by the way, this is not the first time we have been engaging the Americans. We all know that goes back.
You know, but I've had people, for example, refer to the Vienna Convention of 1963 that gives some immunities to diplomats.
Yes.
And juxtapose it to this agreement that the amount of, or the number of immunities given to the United States military in this agreement is even far more than what we give to the to diplomats in that Vienna Convention in 1963 as signed.
Well, I don't know the weight that we place on the Americans, but the fact is that if any nation is engaging another nation, there's a whole lot of protocols, and these protocols are normally guided by the Vienna Convention. You know, country to country, our diplomats are in some countries, and we also host some diplomats. So these conventions are there to protect the interests of these various countries that are engaging each other. So I think when Americans are engaging you, they want to make sure the citizens, their citizens that they are bringing to your country are protected in some ways. Just as if we, as Ghanaians, we are sending officially a delegation to America, for that matter any other country, we seek to protect them whilst they are there. So these conventions are there. Now, if it's a matter of the Americans getting more because they are bringing more people and more materials, and the engagement is not an ordinary visit by tourists. These are soldiers come with equipment, some materials, and these materials will have to use our ports. And then again, because it is the whole thing is couched within the diplomatic kind of conventions, then whatever material they come with will be under that convention.
Prof, final question. Could this deal or this agreement have been better negotiated than what we have now?
Certainly. Any agreement with any other country can be better managed. But you see, I think the way it is now, I think both sides are entrenched. I think the president certainly feels very strongly about what he's done, just as those who oppose to this agreement also feel strongly about their position. So I think it's now time for some kind of dialogue. I think the president, as our leader, should take the lead in engaging those opposed to this idea, because certainly before the implementation of the agreement, I think there can be room for some discussions with the Americans to take care of some of the main concerns that people have expressed. I think it's possible. So I would suggest strongly that the president find a way backdoor, because, you know, in diplomacy or in conflict resolution, we have what you call face-saving device. The president cannot step down. It will be suicidal for him to do that. Just as perhaps those who are opposed to him can also not step down. So there must be a face-saving device that will help the two sides to come to a certain consensus to allow this thing to work. So I think a dialogue at the moment is very important.
So that was an earlier interview I had with Professor Bafo Ajimendia, who is a former senior governance advisor to the United Nations on this particular deal. But just so you know, the Defense Minister, Dominic Nitiwo, has indicated that there has to be an issuance of a note verbal before the execution of the details of this particular agreement. We'll wait to see in the coming days as we still discuss all of this. But here, thank you so much for staying with us here on News at 10 on TV3. On behalf of the rest of the team, we are indeed grateful. Do have a good night. My name is Alfred Okanse.